Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Mohsin Mughal. Sudan remains on edge after long-time leader Omar Al-Bashir was ousted in a military coup. His removal came after months of protests, which culminated in demonstrators surrounding the country's military headquarters, putting them in direct standoff with its rulers. On April 11th, Sudan's military leaders announced Bashir had been arrested and removed from power. But that wasn't enough to convince everyone to leave the streets. Protest leaders say demonstrations will continue unless the country's military hands power over to a civilian-led authority. The generals say power will be handed over within 2 years. Major groups leading the revolt are calling for an end to corruption and cronyism, which they blame for an ongoing economic crisis that gripped Sudan during Bashir's last year in office. The deposed leader, who hasn't been seen since being ousted, has been transferred to a maximum security prison on the outskirts of the capital, Khartoum. Meanwhile, Sudan's Arab neighbors are publicly backing the military, while the African Union is calling for power to be handed to a civilian authority within 15 days. They say failure to comply risks suspension from the African Union. And joining me now is Mehmet Özkan, who's a senior fellow at the Center for Global Policy. He's written extensively on Turkey's role in Africa. And also with us is El-Sadiq El-Sheikh, who's a Sudanese author and director of the Global Justice Program at the US-based Haas Institute. Gentlemen, thanks for being here on Straight Talk. Omar al-Bashir has been in power for nearly 30 years, and yet he has had to wrap it all up within days. Mehmet, the country actually has seen no one but Omar al-Bashir for 3 decades. Is it going to be an easy transition? Is it going to be a smooth transition?
You know, it will be difficult. You know, any transition is not that easy. But there are one thing we should separate from the Arab Spring that we had. You know, in Sudan, the opposition are not Islamist. You know, there's a difference from the Arab Spring. That gives me some hope that the transition will get some support from outside. That's one dynamic. At the same time, you know, there's also another possibility that it might turn up a soft version of Egypt, which is extremely controlled by military. We will see what will happen. But any transition will not be happy because economy is very bad in Sudan. You know, regional dynamics is working against them as well because Sudan has already, you know, divided 2011. Then now there are other issues as well. So transition will not be easy. But hopefully, you know, this time in that area, there will be some positive support from outside that then we can see a real transition in Sudan.
Since you're talking about Egypt, El-Sadiq, one would say, okay, there were protests, Omar al-Bashir gave in, there was a coup, the military takes over, promises a transition, but the situation seems a little bit more complicated. People aren't even happy with that military council. Why are they so suspicious of the military?
That's a very great question. I think the Sudanese opposition, and particularly the leadership of the youth and Sudanese Professional Association, they're extremely aware of the complexity of the Sudanese landscape, the political one. So you see, they know for the last 3 decades, I mean, the whole entire civil services and armed forces and security apparatus, all is filled up and being recruited by the deposited ruling party, which is still enjoying vast freedom in the country. So how is this different? Because I can't imagine that if I'm in the street that I will have any trust on those generals. Those generals, in my opinion, they are the plan B of the ruling party. So whether Burhan or Hemeti, both of them are really, I'm very suspicious. And both of them, maybe General Burhan have a little bit cleaner kind of record, but the other guy, his vice president, and his relationship with United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, these both are very suspicious. And the Sudanese people, maybe they are quiet about this for now, but they are opposing that we have to involve, for example,
but with these sort of questions about the military council, even that military council, if we look at it, if we look at the situation at the face of it, hasn't been a stable military council as well. Within 24 hours, Lieutenant General Awad has announced his departure. Do you think, Mehmet, that there is a credible alternative which this military council can bring in?
I think
at
the
all?
only, the question here, how long will that military council will govern this country? When they will have the election. If they put initially 2 years period, then whether it will be short or long, that's the issue. Because if you prolong this process much longer, then that means you get more military influence and more military embedment. Later on, it becomes more difficult because people on the street, they lose their hope and they lose their even motivation to go to street. So I think time period should be very clear from the beginning. That's why there is pressure from the street. So we'll see how that will happen. That's why one general left is as you mentioned. So we'll see how that will play out. I think they don't know what to do now. That's the issue. They are just changing very fast, and they don't know how to put a transition framework.
But this is not the first time that this has happened in the country. I mean, the protests of this scale have happened in the country in 1964, in 85 as well, where again the rising prices and bad economy was one of the reasons. But give me a general perspective. How is 2019 different?
2019 is different because most of the people who protest in what they call themselves Shabab, the youth of the country, most of them born within the former regime. So they never seen anything except. And they've been accustomed to hear lies and promises and broken promises. So that's make their life extremely difficult. And they are extremely brilliant. So, and they didn't have faith even in political landscape because it's just absent with all the oppression and working from underground. So it's different because, first of all, I think the Sudanese youth, and particularly in the forefront of them is the young women, and Sudanese society are fed up with military experimentation. So just to get back to Mohamed's point, I think I don't think this military council will survive because of exactly what I said, because people just have no trust. And the only legitimacy now they try to betray, despite they have support from a couple of other outside governments.
So there's still more reasons for us to believe that there will be a lot of instability in the coming days, and we'll be watching how the transition works out. Mehmet, Sudan is a strategic ally for Turkey as well. How do you see Turkey's role in the region panning out from here on?
Actually what's happening in Sudan actually is working against what Turkey has been trying to do in the region. And as we told before, Turkey actually trying to bring a regional balance in the Horn of Africa. Historically, there are two balances there. On the one side, Somalia and Sudan. On the other side, Ethiopia and Kenya. But Somalia already has lots of problems, and Sudan has been divided since in 2011.
Yeah.
Now another problem. So I mean, if you look at Turkish policy now, Turkey is observing, trying to help from the beginning. I was closely following the messages from Turkey. They focus on unity, and they are with Sudanese people, so they are supportive. But so far, we didn't see any active Turkish role in this crisis yet.
But how is it going to impact on Turkey's future?
I think in general there will not be an impact because in Sudan, Turkey enjoys very good relation with Sudan from all levels.
Yeah.
But the nature of relations, perhaps style, tactics might change a little bit. But I don't expect any radical change in terms of Turkey and Sudan relations.
Al-Sadiq also mentioned this earlier when he was talking about the several other external influences, and there is an argument, Mehmet. I want you to tell us about whether you buy that argument or not, that the military coup in Sudan or lack of stability in the country is of interest of the Western governments and perhaps some Arab countries as well.
The case of Sudan is really different because Sudan has been left. It's not really part of the Arab politics for a long time, and even the division of Sudan, South Sudan. I think we should put some blame on Egypt and other countries as well. But there is, because Sudan has been on the spotlight after 9/11, when when war on terror, the case has been on the spotlight. But that went down a little bit. But now still, Sudan is a very critical country because of them, because of other issues, because we talk about now more terrorism and different groups. So it's still important. But the issue is, there are many other issues and they don't really focus on it. But hopefully, with some positive force, there will be a positive transition and that will bring a little bit more stability to the Horn of Africa and economic well-being. Also, the African perspective has been divided a lot, especially since 2005 when the outside power went to Africa. Each African unity on acting issues has been eliminated because each country has tried to have bilateral relations with India, with China, with Turkey, with other countries for their own benefit. That's why you don't see any African stance as well, as we talk African solution for African problems in the past as well.
That's where Turkey stands as a distinct player.
Yeah.
Al-Sadiq, whatever the result is, whatever happens after the transition, whether or not it's a short transition, it takes a lot of time or not, the fact remains that the country's economy is in crisis at the moment. How can that problem be solved immediately to bring some relief to the people?
I think the problem with that is there is a structural problem, and I agree that there is need for short-term solutions. There is multiple ways with accepting some assistance from international communities. But however, I think the lasting solution will be in forgiving the debt, the national debt of the Sudanese state, because the people are not responsible for 30 years of mismanaging that wealth. And the second thing, Sudan also extremely capable of taking care of themselves if there is a good management of the state economy. I agree with you. It's not going to be an easy transition. So I hope that people don't think that tomorrow everything will be solved. We have to take it one problem at a time. I think that the urgent problem is the problem of handing over the power into civilian rules. I cannot emphasize this enough. Military does not have the capacity or the intellect actually to solving the problem. The reason why we have this instability problem in Sudan, because we've been ruled by 3 different dictatorships and none of them been successful. So I'm not quite sure why we even think through that. This civilian will be always right? I'm not sure, but we can at least put pressure on them. And I think
but there definitely has to be an intent made clear, at least for the people who've been protesting there, that there will be a transition and it will be for the good of the country.
But it's true.
Still, that country remains in dire situation when they're talking about its economy. Gentlemen, thanks very much for being on Straight Talk.
Thank you very much.
The terrorist attack in Christchurch, New Zealand on March 15th sent yet another wake-up call about the growing threat of Islamophobia. World leaders have spoken out, communities are trying to bridge divides, but Muslim leaders across the globe say a lot more needs to be done to combat the rising tide of anti-Muslim hatred. Recently, Istanbul played host to a 3-day conference to address the rise of Islamophobia, bringing together experts who work to flesh out its root causes. Omar Kablan has more.
The terror attack on March 15 that left 50 people dead in New Zealand sent shockwaves across the world. But for many Muslims, it didn't come as a surprise. At the time of the New Zealand attacks, many national leaders blamed this on a global rise in Islamophobia. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan called the shootings the latest example of rising racism and Islamophobia. Imran Khan, Pakistan's Prime Minister, echoed that sentiment, blaming the attack on the current Islamophobia post 9/11, where 1.3 billion Muslims have collectively been blamed for any act of terror. And it's not just ordinary people who are accused of fueling the suspicions. Recently, US President Donald Trump has been criticized for retweeting a video that was edited to suggest US Congresswoman Ilhan Omar was dismissive of the September 11, 2001 attacks. She has since received numerous death threats, many accusing Trump of inciting violence against Omar, calling the move Islamophobic. Much of the global research on the subject on Islamophobia points to a worrying trend. An independent monitoring group, Tal Mama, found that in Britain there was a 6-fold increase in anti-Muslim hate crimes following the New Zealand terrorist attack. And according to data from the Council on American Islamic Relations, a civil rights group based in the US, there has been a consistent rise in anti-Muslim incidents in the US, including attacks on mosques. Many NGOs and human rights organizations are warning about the rise in attacks on Muslim communities, particularly in Western countries. Academics and researchers are pointing the blame at specific policies in some countries and social media for fueling the rise in hate crimes. And at an international conference on Islamophobia in Istanbul earlier this month, academics from Turkey and abroad discussed what was fueling the rise in Islamophobia.
you start to see those who are pandering in Islamophobic rhetoric gaining political steam. And so when we look at the rise, it's not because there are actual geopolitical acts. It's actually because anti-Muslim sentiment is a socially and politically acceptable form of bigotry that exists in the United States today. And so politicians use it.
Social media has been the ground of infestation for Islamophobia. And what we need is how to counter this by also shedding light on the increasing attacks, Islamophobic attacks, but also to proactively make sure that social media is part of the solution.
According to a report published in 2016 by the Council on American Islamic Relations and the University of Berkeley, Islamophobia has become a lucrative business in the United States. More than $200 million was spent towards promoting fear and hatred of Muslims in the United States by multiple institutions and organizations between 2008 and 2013. And with the rise of far-right parties in recent years, the question remains if this problem will be tackled or if governments will continue to remain silent. Omar Bashir, Straight Talk.
And joining me now is Anne Norton, who is a professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania. She's written on post-colonialism and Muslim identity in the West. Also with us is Salman Saeed, who is a professor of rhetoric and decolonial thought at the University of Leeds. He's written extensively on the rise of Islamophobia. Thanks very much, both of you, for joining us here on Straight Talk. And the fear of Islam, apprehensions against Muslims, the panic, clash of civilizations. How realistic is it?
It is a real phenomenon, and it's a phenomenon that puts many lives at risk. It is a relatively small phenomenon, but because of the amplification of that phenomenon on the internet and through social media, and unfortunately on certain mainstream venues, it has become a development that puts lives at risk and also corrupts the polity by breaking us up into communities of faith rather than a common citizenship in which people are allowed to worship as they choose.
After 9/11, Salman, there was a surge in Islamophobia, the hate crimes directed at Muslims. I'm not trying to say there wasn't Islamophobia before that.
Sure.
It did exist. But here we are, like 2 decades later. Where are things now?
Well, I think Islamophobia has become part of the grammar and language of international relations. So if you think about how many regimes there are throughout the world who equate Muslims with invaders or terrorists or extremists, etc., throughout the world. And that's part of this kind of language of the war on terror, that the war on terror has instituted a set of practices. You can notice that at airports, but also a set of rhetoric, how people talk about certain issues, how they talk about Muslims, what the solutions to Muslim problems are, etc. All of these things are the way in which much of international relations, international discussions are now conducted. Most governments have some kind of countering violent extremism program running around. Most of them speak about Muslims and terrorists in the same breath. So I think the problem has become deeply embedded. I mean, in many ways, what you're seeing with the war on terror is equivalent to the Cold War in terms of its longevity, because no one thought that after 20 years later we'd still be talking about these sorts of things after 9/11. And you can see how you've had a development of institutions and deeply and people who've been socialized into working for those institutions, who are looking for and trying to conduct these kinds of practices, which basically depend on marginalizing Muslim voices and Muslim hopes.
And that's pretty much a dangerous trend which is setting in.
Oh, absolutely. It's profoundly dangerous. It's dangerous both to Muslims, who are constantly put at risk. It's dangerous for people of color more generally, who may either be taken for Muslims or who also become targets of this xenophobic rage. But finally, it is dangerous for the countries that permit this, because one has an obligation to defend one's citizens, whatever their religion, but also to defend what are fundamentally human rights, the rights that belong to all people as human beings.
So Islamophobia by certain governments is definitely being institutionalized. I would say banning of hijab, blocking immigrants, mostly from the Muslim countries. Is it now being institutionalized as a matter of policy?
You know, I may sound unduly hopeful here, and of course it differs from nation to nation. But in some respects, I've been impressed by the ways in which the courts have stood against it in the United States, who have said, no, the Muslim ban is not permissible. There are many obstacles that are being placed in the way of those forms of discrimination. And in the United States, the election of 2 Muslim representatives, one hijabi, one not, has made an enormous difference in producing a public face for Islam that is clearly integrated into the United States, but maintaining its own identity as Muslim. And that provides a model not only for Muslims in the United States and elsewhere, but for young women who look up to these women and see them as their representatives as well.
And to a larger extent, it's the women who have been the worst victims of Islamophobia as well.
This is one of the cases about Islamophobia which makes it different from other forms of racism.
Yeah.
In most other forms of racism, the largest victims tend to be men of violence.
Yeah.
In Islamophobia, it tends to be women, especially hijabi women, who actually bear the physical brunt of that violence, the day-to-day violence on that. But not just at that, but to think about some of the main issues which have been defining Islamophobia has been the hijab ban. I mean, in France, for example, the ban has, hijabs are not allowed or very, very difficult for women to go to school wearing a hijab, and there are many, many other countries.
There's a question I'd like to ask you, since you raised this issue of hijab. What happens to the ideals of equality, justice, democracy that these governments otherwise claim to be upholding? Do you see some element of hypocrisy there?
But I think it's more than, I think this is a point that Anne was making, and I think it's really, really important to bear on this mind. What is Islamophobia doing is actually hollowing out the promise of certain types of liberal democracy, partly because of the reasons that Anne mentioned, but fundamentally what Islamophobia does is transform the relationship between state and civil society. It starts off by simply transforming the relationship between, let's say, Muslim communities and the state and civil society. But ultimately, that legislation framework that's put in begins to affect everybody. So, for example, many of the kind of restrictions that are imposed initially on Muslims, for example, in terms of gathering or in terms of fear of extremism, etc., become much, much more larger and affect everybody. So the issue here isn't just Muslims. The reason why you need to oppose Islamophobia is because what is happening with the imposition of Islamophobia is the possibility of a different kind of relationship between citizens and their government, and that is what is at stake
and between
here.
the citizens in between as
Yes.
well. And do you think politicians use Islamophobia to serve their political interests as well?
Oh, of course they do. I mean, unprincipled politicians, surely. But I think Salman is exactly right, that what one sees here, as you said, is a betrayal of fundamental principles on which these nations are supposedly grounded. And so it does present a threat to all of us, because, in the old phrase, they came for them today, but they will come for me tomorrow. Yeah. And so one sees politicians using this as a tool to appeal to the ignorant or the bigoted or the simply fearful among their constituencies. And that is the basest form of opportunism.
That leads to this question, Salman, and I'll take this away to another aspect. Correct me if I'm wrong. Conflict zones, such as Kashmir, Rakhine in Myanmar, both are Muslim majority regions. Are the governments using a false or manufactured fear of Islam to probably cover up the genuine political aspirations of the people?
I think what they've been able to do is translate their policies. In both those cases you mentioned, and also you could add Palestine to it, and you could also have the case of the Uyghurs, these are long-standing issues. And the rights of these people in all of these communities and territories has been systematically reduced for decades. But what's happened now is they translate those policies into a common lexicon of Islamophobia. So they will say that, for example, the Kashmiris or the Rohingya are invaders, or that they are terrorists, or that they are extremists. And they hope by translating those communities' demands, legitimate demands, into that language, they will then be able to deploy this kind of international opprobrium attached to this. So they justify their policies of violence and violations by saying this is actually defending defending themselves from the threat of Islam, etc. And I think that is really the fundamental issue there. And then they buy an audience into this.
And Salman, thanks very much for being on the show.
Thank you.
And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Mohsen Mughal. If you've got any comments, do share them with us on Twitter with #StraightTalk. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.